All right, welcome back. We have so far made our squid body and are ready to start making tentacles. So to start the tentacles again, right, one of the ways that I like to work is I've got a lot of stuff in this scene. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project and start the tentacles there and then bring them back in. And so I'm going to go ahead and say new file. I am going to actually close some of these from the previous tutorials. Let's see here. I don't need you or you. And I'm just doing this now just to clean up a little bit. Okay, so tentacles. So before we were using splines to create lofts. We can also use a different generator called a sweep. And a sweep, what this does is if you see the icon over here, and maybe what I can do is actually zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. The sweep is, right, you see a white circle, a little squiggly, and then this tube that sweeps along it, right? So this is taking one single cross section and then running it along another spline that it's using as like a path to follow. Okay, so I'm going to create a sweep. We're not going to put anything in it yet, but it's just going to be in the scene. I'm going to pull out again, and we need to do two things. So first, we'll need our cross section. We're not going to worry about that yet. We're going to talk about drawing with some of the spline drawing tools to start with. So instead of creating a primitive for this, we can just click on the spline pen tool. There's also this sketch tool and spline smooth. And so we'll look at all three of these, and we're not going to worry so much about the arc tool right now. So we're going to start with the spline pen. So the spline pen tool works by I'm just going to click someplace. If I click drag, I get a curve. If I just click, I get a hard corner. And right, so you can see that I can do this. Now, the issue is if I rotate this view, you'll see that this spline is at like a strange orientation to the world, right? Generally speaking, it is not advisable to draw splines in perspective view because it's somewhat unpredictable in terms of how it goes. It really just like wherever your camera's aimed, it's going to project it like flat in the scene based on that orientation, right? And then if you rotate your view at all, then they're going to be moving in different directions. It's kind of nuts. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the spline that I just made. And we are going to draw our spline to start with in two-dimensional space. So I'm going to go ahead and choose, let's just say the right view. All right, so I'm choosing the right view, and I want to draw a tentacle, right? And if you are familiar, I'm going to start close to 0, 0. It's not going to be perfect, but if you're familiar, and I'm just going to click once to do that first point, I'm not going to click drag. And then if you've ever worked with Illustrator or any other program that's vector-based, you're going to be very familiar with using a tool in the way that we're using it right now, which is sort of like a Bezier curve drawing tool. So if I click here and drag, right, I can start to create these curves. Now, again, if you are unfamiliar with drawing in this way, it can be kind of a nightmare. So I've created a few points. Let's say this is where I want my tentacle to end. If I hit escape at this point, right, that will stop me from drawing. If I want to continue drawing, I can't remember if I just click. Yeah, I can just click on the end point and continue. Or if for some reason I wanted to continue to start somewhere else, I can click at the start point and add another point that way. If I want to add a point in the curve, I can hold down Control to add a point anywhere along this curve to have, like I say, I want one here, and then I can move this, I can pull this up or do whatever. Also, right, if I just hover over the curve, I can just click and drag to tweak the shape of that curve, which was not possible until very recently. It's kind of actually a really nice feature because it's a little bit more intuitive than attempting to manipulate things by using the handles. If you accidentally create a hard corner, so if I was to click here and click, and now I'm going to hit escape, and I actually wanted this to be a soft corner, what I can do is I can either hit the space bar to select my live selection tool, or I can just go up there and click on it. And if I select this point and I right click, let's see here, is that going to work? No, I'm going to have to be either, I think either in move or on the, nope, not on the move tool. So I'm just testing things out to see what's here. So I need to be on the pen tool. I can right click and I have a few options here. I have delete point, disconnect point, hard tangents, or soft tangents. This is already a hard tangent, so I'm going to click soft tangents, and that will put that curve back in there. Conversely, if I was like, oh, I really want this tentacle to have a really hard corner, right? I can always say hard tangents here. If I undo that, and if I click on a different point, I can just say delete point. That point will go. If I, however, say disconnect point, what that's going to do is it's actually going to create a break in my spline, right? That's not something we typically want to do. We want this to be smooth. And you know that your points are all connected if it's a nice gradient from this whitish blue to a much deeper blue. I don't need quite so many of these points, so I could either select them and delete them. I can also use my live selection tool, select it and hit delete, and it will delete that point. All right. So let's say that's one way of drawing a tentacle. So another way of drawing a tentacle is to use the sketch tool. Now the spline sketch tool is basically like a freehand tool. I can just click and drag and it's going to follow whatever I do. Note that there is this stroke smoothing. There's a radius setting, the blend setting, and then this create new spline. I am going to, because one issue is like if I start drawing now, it's going to be in the same spline object. So if I deselect that spline, so it's grayed out, and I click over here and start drawing, you'll see that now I have a separate spline that's been created, and I've got this point here. But let's say, right, this can be really useful because I can get more quickly I can get something I'm interested in. However, you can see this is somewhat sloppy, right? If I go ahead and delete that and I crank this to 100% on my stroke smoothing and click and drag, right, I'm going to get a smoother result, but it's still kind of lumpy in here. And so one of the ways I can clean this up, and honestly, I typically use Sketch, and then the spline smooth is the main way I draw splines that I don't need to be precise, but by hand I feel like I do a better job. So I'm going to go to spline smooth, and what this does is if I just go ahead and say there's like an area with a lot of points and I click, it's going to remove some of those points and do some smoothing, right? And so maybe I actually want that to be a little bit smoother, right? Maybe this corner is a little bit too hard for what I want. I want that to smooth out. And you'll see sometimes it actually adds points to make the rounding a little bit better. I can also click and drag, but that, right, does it has a pretty heavy influence. So individual clicks are sometimes the best bet. I'm pretty happy with the way that this tentacle looks. Okay, so we've got our base spline. We've got one or two splines we can choose to use for this sweep. And so let's go ahead and I'm going to use this spline that I did freehand. I'm going to go ahead and drop this in my sweep. Now, in this view, I'm never going to see anything right yet, and nothing's happening here. And that's because we need a cross section that is going to be essentially, swept along this spline. So I'm going to go ahead and create a circle. It does not need to be 200 centimeters wide, because this is the thickness or the diameter or radius of our tentacle. So I'm going to set it to 10 for now, right, which is significantly smaller. I'm going to leave it in its current orientation, and we're going to see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this down into my sweep. And note that the way that sweeps work, and this is clearly, I'm going to make this full screen. There we go. Right, it's flat. Something isn't right yet. It is sweeping, but it's sweeping it along in a flat way, which can be useful for certain things, but right now this isn't so useful for us. First, I want you to note that if the cross section should be the first child, the path that we're sweeping along, or the spline we're sweeping along, should be the second. If I change this order, right, I get a very different result. And this is kind of super cool, but it's not what we want at all, right? This is not a tentacle. So order is important. If you get a result like that, things are going crazy. And then the other thing that's important is which plane in my circles attributes this circle is aligned with. So if I switch to XY, now suddenly I have thickness. If I was to go to XZ, right, it's going to be flat in the other direction. All right. And so this is just something where sometimes you just have to like put the circle on there, figure out what orientation it is. It takes no time for it to figure that out. Okay, so now this is looking nice and smooth and curvilinear. However, it's the same thickness at the front end and the back end, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to go to my spline, or sorry, not my spline. I'm going to go to my sweep, and we need to look at some of these other object settings here, right? We haven't really looked at any of these yet. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on display Gerard shading lines so we can kind of see what's going on with this geometry. So the first thing I want you to note is that, right, anywhere there's a curve, the polygons are a lot closer together. There's more of them. Anywhere there's a straight area, it's more stretched out. Sometimes this doesn't matter depending on the material you're using. It'll look fine. Other times, if you notice you have texture, like if, say, you get to a point where putting some noise on, like a noisy texture, which basically just means it has like varying values that are randomized. If you notice that it seems like the texture is a lot smaller here and it gets streaked and stretched out here, then there's some changes we need to make. And so the first thing that we should probably do is we want to go to our spline, the path that we're going along. And right now, intermediate points are set to adaptive. And basically that means that if the angle is, I can't remember if it's greater than 5 degrees or, basically, if there's more curve, there's going to be more points and more geometry. If there's less curve, there's going to be less points. And so we can change this from adaptive to uniform. And you'll see that that makes all of this geometry even. If you're having texture issues down the line, once you put a material on here, that is why. Right, or at least that's one of the reasons why, is that that it's being stretched and tweaked in weird ways. And if you just switch that to uniform, you get much more even subdivisions. The same goes for the circle. If I select the circle, you'll see it's already set to uniform and my number of intermediate points is 8. If I don't need this many polygons or I want more, I can adjust this. So I can say, if I said 4 here, right, I'm going to get far fewer. This is actually going to be much more performant in terms of like, it's not as stressful for the computer. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to 4 because I don't need all 8 of those for this tiny little tentacle. Now I'm going to go back to my sweep. And on the sweep, you'll see one of the settings I have is end scale. This is one of the times when, right, the directionality of the spline matters. If I go ahead and pull this down, you'll see that it's going to, right, shrink to nothing by the end. And suddenly I have something that looks much more tentacle-y. I can also, fill this back out. And I'm actually going to leave this at 100 because there's something else I want to show you that's a pretty great setting. We don't have any concerns with rotation, but I want you to see, do you see how the surface is twisting here? If we had like, we just don't need to worry about this. But if it was like if we were trying to do like a twisted, like say we have squares here as our cross section, and we wanted it to have like twists all the way down it, that's what we would use. And the end growth and start growth, you can see we can actually, and this is something that's usually more for animation, but we could actually animate this thing growing along the spline. End growth is the same thing. Oops, I missed that. I don't know why I can't click on it. There we go. Right. So I can have it, grow. Like if this was something that was like a tentacle or something growing, I can have it grow there. There are a bunch of other settings here we are not going to worry about right now. But there's something down here that it's a detail called details that always gets lost in the details because it's a little tiny thing with a little tiny arrow next to it. If I click this drop down arrow, the setting I wanted to show you is this scale setting, and there's actually this rotation setting. I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can kind of see this, and I might scale this out and move this over so you can see what's happening at the same time. So this is a graph that maps the scale of the spline from start to finish, from this point in this case to this point. If I just grab this endpoint and scale it down, I'm going to have the exact same result as I had when I did the end scale slider. However, with this graph, I have a lot more control. First, I can click on this little triangle and I can change the rate at which that slope happens. I can also come over here and hold down Control and click on the line and add a new point. So if I wanted things to like thin out somewhere else, or maybe you know, I mean, granted, the tentacle is not going to do this, but maybe I want the tentacle to go thin in the middle and get fatter at the end, right? You can have like a lot of freedom in terms of how you control the scale on this thing, which is pretty awesome. This graph is like incredibly useful. There are a bunch of presets as well. Yeah, right. There's a bunch of different types of curves we can do. Sometimes that's useful. For this tentacle, really, I just wanted it to stay fat longer and then taper at the end. And maybe it doesn't even need to get all the way small. Maybe I want to bring this up just a touch more, right? So that it's a little bit thicker there at the end. And this is something where, right, you can experiment with it. If I want to remove this point, I'm pretty sure I hit Control and click. No. I can't remember. Maybe I just select it and hit delete. Yep, that's how I removed that point. But so in my case, actually having that point, I actually liked the way that I was able to keep it thicker longer and then have that slope go a little bit steeper. Right. So this is something that gets lost a lot, but it's really, really useful. Okay. So let me go ahead and zoom out from there. We've got this amazing tentacle. I am going to select my sweep. And then in this view, I'm going to hit S. So the one tentacle is selected and then pull out from it. Right. I don't really need this other spline at this point. But because what we're going to do is we're just going to create copies of this tentacle now. And we're going to use an array to do it. They're all going to look the same. But we'll look at one other step we can do to then, right, add some individuality to the tentacles once we get several of them done. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this other spline because I don't like that curve very much. Then I'm going to go ahead and go to my generators, go to array, and I'm going to drop this sweep in as a child of the array. And now I have this amazing, strange wraparound thing where they're intersecting each other, and that's not exactly what I want to have happen, right? So I'm going to select my array, and part of it is the radius, and part of it is the position of my object. So you'll note, right, if I make my radius really small, these things are actually coming out, and that's because if I turn this off, my sweep is like offset a little bit from 0. That starting point isn't at 0. These are things I could potentially change if I want to, but honestly, the array position is working pretty well. I could have them all joined together, or I could have them spread out a bit. Remember, they're going to be hidden under a skirt. And so I can, they just need to be tucked up in there. And so this is a pretty good setting for me, 24 centimeters, depending on where and how you drew yours. You might not have the issue I had. You might need to adjust it more. If for some reason it's really off and you need to fix it, first we can turn the array off. Or if I turn the array on, but I have the sweep selected and I try and move it, right, nothing's going to happen. But what I need to do is I need to go into my sweep. I need to select my spline, and I need to make sure that I am in model mode. Then if I move my spline over, and I'm going to turn the array off, you can see that that is making changes, right? But if I pull my spline over and set it somewhat close to 0, and I can look, and say, yep, that's pretty close. It doesn't have to be perfect. So that first point is set to 0. Then I turn my array back on, And now it should work as normal, right? I should be able to, oh, it's actually doing the opposite, right? But they're all coming from that central point now. Perfect. So now I could say, oh, actually, it would be better if this was even further away, right? But so this is probably good. I'm going to leave things in the array right now. I'm going to call this tentacles. And then I'm going to select the tentacles. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to go back to my squid. I'm going to paste my tentacles into the scene. And you will see I've got a little bit of a scale problem, right? These are absolutely tiny compared to the scale of this squid. So I may want to scale all of this up. So I'm going to go ahead and select my tentacles, go to coordinates, and I could try and scale it this way, but I'm just going to set this to 5, 5, and 5. All right, now those are some pretty massive tentacles. Maybe I should do 4, right? 4, 4, and 4 is a little bit more sane. Again, they're pretty long, but we're going to leave them as they are. I'm going to hit the letter E so I can move this whole object. And what I want to do is I want to pull these up. And you can see maybe my splines need to be adjusted a little bit, or perhaps I need to adjust this in a little bit. So I've got this strange view here, but you can see they're starting to intersect that skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this tentacles, select this, go to object. I have this set to 0, right? If I was to increase my size, you can see that that actually pushes these a little bit closer together. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten that up a bit, rotate this view, and then again, I could lift this up a little bit. Right, so they're tucked in. Again, right, if I was shooting this scene from this orientation, obviously having the tentacles end this way in a flat plane probably isn't great, but if I'm doing this from any other orientation, this actually looks pretty great, right? Granted, these tentacles are kind of insanely long, and it takes this kind of cute squid head and makes it look terrifying, but we've got what we've got, right? I could always go in to my spline here, and I could go to points mode. I could turn off my tentacles here and turn off my sweep. And I could always say, okay, I need this to be a little bit shorter. So I'm going to select this point, delete it, maybe select this point, delete it, turn this back on, see what that tentacle looks like. You know, maybe it's probably still a little bit too long and too skinny. I could always increase the thickness of the circle, maybe make this like 20, right? So I have a little bit chunkier tentacle, although that's kind of terrifying too. Maybe 15 would be a little bit better, just a little bit more chunk to it. And then I could always continue to step this back. And you'll note that it's still going to taper the same way. It's just going to do it over a shorter period of time. So I'm going to uncheck this, and I'm going to use my live selection tool. And let's go ahead and I'm just going to delete like, 3 or 4 points right now, and just see what happens here. Also, if I click and drag, if I have these red check marks and I click and drag, I can do multiple things at the same time. All right, this still looks terrifying because it looks like it's popping out and going to creep on everybody, but that's fine. We're going to leave it just like this. So now one of the other settings I can do is I can, we've talked about making things editable to make a spline editable to be able to do this deviation in the top here. I can also make generators editable. And what that's going to do in this case, if I go to tentacles and I right click and I say make editable, what that's going to do, it turns the tentacles object into a null object. I open this up, and now I have 8 sweeps, which means that each one of these is independently controllable. So if I wanted to, say, select the spline on sweep 8 and turn the sweep off, right, and I want to move how these points are aligned, right, I can go ahead and stretch this point. I could rotate this, and granted, I'm doing this in 3D space, which honestly, right, if I move my camera a little bit and select individual points, I can now say, oh, I don't want this just in 2D, right? I can actually have these points kind of scoot around. And I can say, let's grab these handles, and maybe I need to use the move tool to do that. But if I grab this handle, I should be able to, right, rotate my point like this, right, turn this on. And so now I have these 8 copies, right, that are all uniform, but then I can go ahead and give them individual positioning, which is really great and useful. Okay, so this is the tentacles part of the tutorial. Let's go ahead and save our work. And for the next section, we're going to be using the lathe to take a spline and essentially lathe it, which basically means we do like a rotational thing, and we'll use that to make the eyes. And then we will be done with our squid.